Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. In this video, we are going to look at Checking Out My History, 2005 by John Agard. This is a poem about how black people were not taught about their own history, but were taught about European history instead, resulting in a loss of identity. The poem lists many important people and events in Black history that should have been taught, but instead European history and even children's rhymes were taught in their place. And there we have John Agard. So he was born in 1949 in Guyana, a small country in South America. It's at the top of South America. Used to be a British colony, is now independent. So he's a playwright, a poet, a short story and children's writer. He wrote for newspapers before moving to England in 1977 and becoming a lecturer. He's very interested in promoting cross-cultural understanding. He played a key role in the Windrush season of programs in 1998. He has won many prizes and he's married to the black poet Grace Nichols, who actually has a very similar background to him. So this is the glossary for the poem, but it's a bit different to the other glossaries. It's not so much difficult words, but it's all the names and dates that are mentioned in the poem. So the poem is not difficult in the sense that it doesn't use a lot of difficult words, but all these references does make it confusing initially. So if you can just pause the video here and just read through these 2 or 3 times, you don't need to learn them unless you really want to, but it's useful to be aware of them. And these are the techniques he uses. So he does use some fairly standard techniques, but he also uses some quite unusual ones. And notice here, I don't give a definition, but italics basically means that kind of a writing. It's used for emphasis usually. Okay, so please do pause the video here and just read through these names and dates 2 or 3 times. That will really help you to understand the poem better. So I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so let's listen to the audio version. And we are lucky enough to have the poet himself reading it. But I would just warn you that he actually says tiny bits of it differently to the written version. Okay, but that's okay. Don't worry too much about that.
Them tell me what them want to tell me. Bandage up me eye with me own history, blind me to me own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and E-Cat, but Toussaint Louverture, you know, them never tell me about that. Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick back, Napoleon, battalion, and first black republic born. Toussaint, the thorn to the French. Toussaint, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me about the dish, run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the maroon. Nanny, seafar, woman of mountain, dream, fire woman, struggle, hopeful, stream to freedom, river. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shaka the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and She Lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary C. Cole. From Jamaica, she traveled far to the Crimean War. She volunteered to go even when the British said no. She braved the Russian snow, a healing star among the wounded, a yellow sunrise among the dying. Them tell me what them want for tell me. But now I checking out me history. I carving out me identity.
Okay, so as I said, he did say it slightly differently to the written version, but that's okay. Right, so the poem begins with repetition, them tell me, and obviously this word should is meant to be them, and he's referring to the Europeans, and he's talking about himself as the poet and the narrator, but also it's not really just him. He's obviously referring to black people in general and saying how the Europeans just taught them what they wanted to teach them rather than what the black people should have been taught. And then here we have the word bandage, which has connotations of damage and blindness. So again, obviously metaphorical. Both of these lines are metaphors. So how their identity was taken away from them by not being taught their own history. And then here he starts off telling all the dates and names that they were taught instead of the black history. So 1066, Battle of Hastings, very important date in English history, but and it's important to learn other people's history, but first you have to learn your own history, right? And not only that, not only were they taught important English dates and names, they were taught these children's rhymes, which were not so important. So this is a famous children's story, and instead of being taught about Toussaint Louverture, who was a great black general, there he is there. He was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, and he actually defeated Napoleon's army. And Napoleon, a European general, was one of the greatest generals in history, and most people know about him, but hardly anybody knows about Toussaint, which is very strange and unusual. And notice here the short lines for the Black history and it in italics, and also the short lines give you that fast kind of rap-like rhythm, whereas the European history is in the long lines, and there is a rhyming scheme, but it's very, very simplistic. So the poet is kind of putting down the European history and emphasizing the Black history. So Toussaint started off as a slave, he was uneducated, and look back here, so use of slang as well as informal English. The two things are similar, but not quite the same. We'll talk more about that later. They defeated Napoleon's battalion or his army. So the first Black Republic, first Black Free State that had previously been enslaved was born. And the phrase to be a thorn in somebody's side means to be annoying to them. So he was annoying to the French. So it was the French who were in control of Haiti. And beacon means lamp. So obviously here it's being used as a metaphor. So he was like the main leader of the Haitian Revolution. So the country Haiti and Haitian is quite difficult to pronounce. People pronounce the word differently. Some people say Haiti or Haiti. So I'm just going to say Haiti and Haitian. And he was taught about how the person who discovered the balloon, and in this case referring to hot air balloons, which again is important, but first you have to learn about your own people and their inventions. And then this children's rhyme here that he was taught, and another children's rhyme. So these nursery rhymes are actually quite important. They teach children how to speak, but the black children should have been taught their rhymes, right? And taught to speak their language. And he wasn't taught about this Nani de Maroon, who was a great black female leader. And here, this is a metaphor suggesting that she was a visionary. She could see ahead to her people's freedom. This mountain dream refers to the fact that she built a fortified town on top of a mountain when she was fighting the British. Here's another metaphor, firewoman, and maybe this is suggesting that she was full of fire, something like that. And then Hopeful Stream to Freedom River. So a stream is like a small running water, and then it becomes a big mighty river. So in the same way, a leader can be considered a stream starting small by themselves, recruiting a few people, until they have a lot of people, an army, so they become metaphorically a mighty river to fight the enemy. And then they were taught about Lord Nelson, who was a great British admiral, and also Waterloo, the Battle of Waterloo. These two are not connected, by the way. So again, all these very important dates in British history, but not in Black history. And they weren't taught about Shaka, a great Zulu leader, a South African leader. All right, they were only taught about their own leaders, and then taught about Columbus in 1492. So obviously, Columbus landed in the Americas in 1492, a great date in European history, but not so great for the natives of America. And these tribes, Caribs and the and the Arawaks, these were native Caribbean tribes. They were taken over. A lot of them died from diseases. Others were also killed by the Europeans. And then Florence Nightingale, most people have heard of, a great nurse, a white British nurse. And he was taught about Robin Hood, which is a children's story, and Old King Cole, another children's rhyme. But he wasn't taught about Mary C. Cole, who was very similar to Florence Nightingale. She was a great black nurse. She was born in Jamaica, but she actually considered herself British. And she also went to the Crimea, the Crimean War, just like Florence Nightingale. But virtually everyone's heard of Florence, but no one has heard of Mary C. Cole, or very few people. And she went from Jamaica all the way to the Crimean War. And initially she volunteered to go, and the British actually said no. But she went anyway, despite the Russian snow, the freezing cold weather. And here, personification, a healing star, and yellow sunrise, obviously, yellow, the sun is yellow, and bringing warmth to, metaphorically speaking, emotional warmth to the dying. And then the poem ends with a cyclical structure with the repetition of Don't Tell Me. But these last two lines are really important, that he's now determined to learn about his own history. So checking out and look back and so on. These are slang words. And this line here is interesting, this word carving. So carving, whether it's carving a turkey or carving something else, can be quite difficult. And the word carving is kind of similar to sculpting, which is usually to do with stone or even metal. So very, very difficult. So it's kind of suggesting that it's going to be very difficult for him to now create his new identity, but he's determined to do it. This shows his determination, I think, this word here, carving. Okay, so that's the poem. So not difficult in terms of the words used, but these references to names and dates can make it confusing. So just a good idea to familiarize yourself with those, but you don't have to learn them by heart. It's not history, this is English. Okay, so AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. So there are some possible quotes. And here are some of the techniques. Please do pause the video and make sure you understand why these techniques refer to these quotes. Okay. I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. So AO2, language, form, and structure using techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases and their effects, so thoughts, feelings, images, and the various possible meanings of a word. So, for example, we talked about the word carving. Here are some random possibilities from the previous slide. And then in terms of form and structure, the poem has 10 stanzas of differing lengths. Well, actually, I'll say differing, but there is a pattern to it. And it says it, and at first glance, it looks and sounds quite random. However, there is a pattern, and there are stanzas with long lines and stanzas with short lines. The long lines are related to the European part of the content, and the short lines are to do with the black part. Sorry, there was a word missing there. I've corrected that. The main stanzas to do with black history are very short, hence with a rap-like rhythm, and are written in italics like that to emphasize them. They are also indented, meaning go pushed in, yeah, which also emphasizes them. And then initially the poem seems like free verse, but the long lines do rhyme, but they have quite a childish rhyming scheme. And the poem also has a cyclical structure ending with Dem Tell Me. And in terms of techniques and terminology, Agard uses many techniques, some of which are not typical, just like his use of English is non-typical. For example, he uses historical events, rap rhythm, italics, but he also does use standard techniques such as personification and repetition. And then in terms of context, you can talk about how he was born in Guyana, but has lived in Britain since the age of 28. So he's very, very bicultural, which kind of explains his poetry and his desire to inform other people about different cultures, especially Black culture, obviously, and very interested in improving cultural understanding between people. And and the fact that he played a key role in the Windrush season of programs in 1998. And the fact that he's married to Grace Nichols, I don't know how you would actually bring that into your essays. It depends on how you write it. But it's interesting to note that quite often, obviously, we are attracted to similar people when we get married. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5, depending on how you write your essay. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. So please do pause the video here and answer these questions. And I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. Here are the answers. Please do pause the video and check your answers. And if you've got anything less than about 50%, if you really struggled, then you really need to go back and listen again. You're aiming for at least 50%, but ideally 70, 90, 100%. And then once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of identity in Checking Out My History? Compare with one other poem in the anthology. We're not going to do that. But you could compare with the Emigre or Tissue. Just be careful with Tissue. It's a very, very challenging poem. So only do that if you're really confident. I mean, Emigre is also quite challenging, but not as challenging as Tissue. And obviously, it would depend on the question that they ask you as well. So always have a main poem in mind that you're going to compare with, but then also 1 or 2 backups depending on the question. So you might start something like this. The poet presents the theme of identity by describing how Black people were not taught about their own history, but instead were taught European history, resulting in a loss of identity. He uses techniques such as non-standard English to do this. And then your first point might be the poem begins with non-standard English and repetition. Them tell me. The informal English is a deliberate act of defiance, and in fact, the poem has a cyclical structure by ending with the same phrase. The phrase is non-standard in 2 ways. Firstly, them means them, but the spelling indicates the way the word is pronounced. Secondly, it would normally be they tell me. So 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion, and a little bit of context would be more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5. You don't need to do a lot to get a grade 4 or 5, okay? So please, please don't panic. Don't sit there with a blank piece of paper. Just get something down. Okay, if you're aiming higher, then let's carry on. So let's look again for these things here. So tone and mood. So obviously a very angry tone, but kind of hidden under that mocking tone, and then which creates quite a sympathetic mood and puzzlement actually from the reader as to, yeah, why did this happen? Obviously, your reaction to a certain extent will depend on your own background, but generally speaking, I think the tone and mood would be as I've just mentioned there. And then rhyme and rhythm, I did mention this earlier. So at first glance, the poem looks a bit random, okay? but when you examine it, there are definite patterns. So we've got the Black history in italics and short rap-like rhythm. We've got the European history long with this simplistic rhyming scheme. In terms of language, the language itself is not very difficult as such, but these references are difficult, so you need to be familiar with them without knowing every single detail, because that could take you hours and days and weeks and months to learn. But in terms of language, some of these metaphors are a little bit tricky. So if you can talk about those, that would be a high grade thing to do. And maybe words like carving, as I've mentioned already. So form, we've talked about rhyme and rhythm and so on, and the structure, the cyclical structure, ending with the repetition of them tell me. And in terms of context, yes, all these names and dates. Okay, so here's the advanced quiz. Please pause the video here and have a good go at answering these questions. I'm going to move to the answer slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So here are some possible answers. So like I say, in this case, doesn't have to be exactly like this. And if you didn't quite get this, then take the opportunity to pause here and learn from this. Just one thing I would say is I've just put these in quotes to make it a bit shorter rather than kind of long explaining longhand what I'm talking about here. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So you have now learned more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. Now, this is a little bit different from my previous examples as well, because the poem is a bit different. So what I've done here is this is kind of similar to the previous one, the grade 4-5 answer. All I've done is add bits to the end. So up to here is the same. And then I've added, he gives many examples of great black history that were not taught, but children's rhymes were taught instead. The poem ties in with the poet's additional job where he travels around making people more aware of other cultures. And then similarly, this is the same as before, except here I've changed the full stop to a semicolon, and then I've added this bit here. Furthermore, the collective pronoun refers to Europeans. The use of the pronoun suggests a vague, unknown, and hence strange and potentially hostile group of people. So the pronoun is this here, they. So this is actually a good example for you to learn from, that quite often the difference between a higher grade and a lower grade is simply what more you add. So the first part might be exactly the same, but then how much more detail you can add. Okay. And then if you're aiming for the highest grades, you might look at these phrases here. So the semantic field of bandage and blindness. Okay. So the blindness is referred to in the line after this one. I haven't got it here. And the use of slang, checking out to learn in this case. Lick back means to defeat. So the difference between slang and informal language or non-standard English, it's a little bit subtle, but there are slight differences. So if you can explain those, that would be a grade 8, 9 thing to do, and the possible connotations of carving and so on. And also, and then rhyme and rhythm. So we talked about the different rhymes and rhythms in the poem, the use of the rap rhythm, the use of italics. And then in terms of context, so the whole point about the Black history, the dates and names and so on. You could maybe make a connection to Black History Month, depending on how you write your essay. And then this is really important. Black history is everyone's history because we all started out from Africa. So in that sense, we all started out as Black people and then kind of branched out. And by the Europeans, by kind of denying this Black history and not teaching it, in a way, shot themselves in the foot, because we now have a gap in that Black history, which we are having to painfully rediscover. Okay. Okay. So, a very, very interesting poem. On the one hand, quite simple in terms of the language used, but these extra details make it a lot more complex and challenging. But once you've got your head around that, if you can complete the essay we started, how does the poet present the theme of identity in checking out my history? And that's it. I hope you found that video enjoyable and useful. And if so, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.